They took his home without shouting, without anger, just paperwork and a deadline. A Navy SEAL who once faced war now stood powerless before a system that no longer needed him. Beside him was only his dog, silent, watchful, loyal in ways people often forget. Together, they left the noise behind and followed a road north, where cold air and quiet truths awaited. They found a place that did not need noise to prove its worth, and realized dignity can still save a life. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe one follow helps keep stories like this alive, please like and subscribe. Now, let's begin the story. The room smelled like toner and disinfectant. It was a clean smell, meant to signal order and neutrality. But to Wesley Hartman, it carried the same hollow chill as an intake bay at dawn. Everything scrubbed, nothing warm, nothing personal. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, the sound thin and persistent, like an insect that refused to die. Wes sat with his back straight, hands resting loosely on his thighs. Not locked, not defensive, just still. At 35, he looked younger than he felt, and older than he should have. His shoulders were broad but relaxed, the posture of a man who had learned long ago how to carry weight without announcing it. His jaw was clean-shaven, the lines sharp, the skin weathered by years of cold wind and high altitude. Dark brown hair lay close-cropped against his skull, a military cut that had grown just long enough to suggest transition without rebellion. Across the desk sat Sarah Linwood, the housing coordinator. She was in her early 40s, slim, slightly stooped from years of leaning forward in chairs like this one. Her hair, light brown with the first threads of gray, was pulled into a practical knot at the base of her neck. She wore wire-rimmed glasses that slid down her nose when she read, and her hands moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned not to promise what she could not deliver. Sarah was not unkind. That was what made this harder. "I'm really sorry, Wes," she said, her voice low and even, not rehearsed. "Just tired." The program's eligibility requirements changed at the start of the quarter. She slid a thin stack of papers across the desk. The printer behind her clicked softly, spooling out another set for someone else. Wes looked at the papers without touching them. "What changed?" he asked. His voice was calm, no edge, no plea. Sarah glanced down, then back up. "The insurance verification. The labor coverage has to be current and employer-backed. Your last contract ended 3 months ago." "I've been working," Wes said. "Training, search and rescue, seasonal." "I know," she replied. "You've been one of our most reliable residents. Quiet, no complaints, always on time." That, Wes thought, was usually the problem. Reliable never made headlines. Quiet never saved budgets. "So that's it," he said, not a question. Sarah nodded once. "We have to reassign the unit." Wes finally reached forward and picked up the papers. They were warm from the printer. He scanned them quickly, not because he needed to understand, but because habit demanded verification. Dates, clauses, signatures. Everything was correct. That was the worst part. Outside the narrow window behind Sarah, spring light reflected off the lingering snowbanks of the northern lakeshore. Michigan's Upper Peninsula did not let go of winter easily. The snow still clung to the shadows beneath the pines, but the air carried something softer now, the promise of melt, of movement. Wes folded the papers neatly and placed them back on the desk. "When do I need to be out?" he asked. Sarah swallowed. "By noon." He nodded. "All right." No argument, no anger. He stood, adjusted the strap of his worn duffel bag over one shoulder, and offered her a small, polite nod, the kind he'd once used with superior officers who had no idea how much their decisions weighed. Sarah hesitated. Wes, this isn't a reflection on you. He met her gaze. His eyes were gray-blue, steady, unreadable. It never is, he said gently. The pickup truck sat in the gravel lot like an old friend who didn't ask questions. Its paint was dulled by salt and winters, wheel wells crusted with the memory of roads that chewed metal for sport. Wes loaded his duffel into the bed with practiced efficiency. No wasted motion, no hesitation. In the passenger seat waited Sable. The German Shepherd was 5 years old, his coat a layered mix of cream, gray, and black that blended perfectly with northern forests. Darker along the spine, lighter at the chest and legs. His amber eyes tracked Wes with quiet precision as the man closed the tailgate. Sable wore a black harness with dark red trim, functional, worn, familiar. He sat upright, posture alert but relaxed, ears forward, not anxious. He did not whine. He did not shift. He watched. Wes climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and let it idle for a moment. The heater coughed, then breathed lukewarm air. He rested his hands on the steering wheel and stared straight ahead. He had been discharged 6 months earlier, not dishonorably, not dramatically, a shoulder injury sustained during training, old damage resurfacing, compounded by years of strain. Surgery had stabilized it, but stability wasn't enough for the kind of work he had trained his body to do. The exit paperwork had been efficient, respectful, final. He had not felt anger then. He had felt displaced. Since then, he had done everything right, stayed useful, stayed available, taught security courses, joined winter search and rescue teams when storms swallowed hikers whole, helped pull people from frozen rivers with hands that still remembered how to move under pressure. He was still strong, still disciplined, still young enough to want more. But none of that fit neatly into boxes labeled funding and verification. He eased the truck out of the lot. The road out of town curved along the lakeshore, the water dark and glassy beneath the pale spring sun. At the marina, a group of children clustered near the docks, fishing lines dipping lazily into the water. Their laughter carried on the wind, sharp and bright. Wes slowed without meaning to. He watched them for a moment. The easy way they occupied space, the way the world still expected them to be there. He wasn't bitter. He just felt outside. Sable shifted slightly in his seat, ears flicking toward the sound, then forward again. Always forward. They passed the last stoplight. The road narrowed, pines thickened on either side, their shadows long and blue against the snow. Wes drove north. He didn't know why. Only that stopping felt worse than moving. 20 minutes later, the truck slowed without Wes touching the brake. Sable had stiffened, not in alarm, not in aggression. Recognition. His body leaned subtly toward the passenger window, head turning toward the lake as it came back into view through a break in the trees. His ears stayed forward, his breathing steady, but his eyes fixed on something unseen. Wes felt it then, a tightening in his chest, sharp and sudden, like the moment before weather breaks. He pulled over. The lake lay open and silent, its surface broken by thin plates of melting ice. The light struck it just right, scattering into 1,000 shifting fragments. Sable did not bark. He did not growl. He simply stared. Wes stepped out of the truck, boots crunching against gravel and oldre, and followed the dog's gaze. There was nothing there. No sign, no movement, just water, light, and the low sound of wind sliding across ice. For reasons he couldn't name, Wes removed his cap. The air felt weighted, not heavy, just attentive. After a long moment, Sable turned his head back toward Wes, eyes meeting his. The look was unmistakable. Notice this. Then, just as quietly, the moment passed. Sable sat. Wes exhaled, unaware he'd been holding his breath. He didn't understand what had just happened. But something inside him had shifted, like a compass needle correcting itself. He drove on. The road climbed gently, pulling them deeper into the north. Snow thinned along the shoulders. Birch trees appeared among the pines, their white bark catching the light. Wes rolled down the window. The air smelled of cold earth and water set free. He didn't have a destination. He didn't need one. Not yet. Sable leaned his head slightly toward the open window, eyes half-lidded, content. The tension from earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter. Acceptance, maybe. Or patience. As the town disappeared behind them, Wes felt the strange, unfamiliar sense of standing at the edge of something. Not an ending, not a beginning. Just a pause. And for the first time since leaving the uniform behind, the pause did not feel like failure. The farther north Wes drove, the more the road seemed to forget where it was going. The lanes narrowed, the shoulder thinned, and the towns that appeared along the shoreline felt less like destinations and more like pauses. Places that existed because people had once stopped moving long enough to name them. Lake Superior lay to his left now, immense and quiet. Its surface broken by slow, deliberate waves that looked more like breath than motion. Wes kept the window cracked. The air smelled different here, cleaner, edged with cold water and pine sap. Spring had arrived in pieces. Snow still lingered in the shade of trees, but sunlight warmed the exposed earth into something dark and alive. Sable sat in the passenger seat, posture loose but alert. His amber eyes tracked the passing landscape, not scanning for threats, not bored, simply attentive. The black harness with its dark red trim rested comfortably against his chest, worn in by months of shared work. He had the calm presence of an animal that understood routine but did not depend on it. Wes noticed that his own breathing had slowed. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding himself together until now. The road curved past a small cluster of buildings near the water. A bakery, a weathered dock, a hand-painted sign advertising smoked fish. On impulse, Wes pulled in. The bell above the bakery door chimed softly when he entered, releasing a wave of warmth and the smell of butter and cardamom. Behind the counter stood Ingrid Halverson, a woman in her late 50s with broad shoulders and a posture that suggested years of lifting sacks of flour without complaint. Her hair was white blonde and braided over one shoulder, her skin ruddy from cold mornings and hot ovens. She looked up, smiled once, and nodded toward Sable. "Good dog," she said simply. Sable's tail moved once, not wagging, acknowledgement. Ingrid poured coffee without asking and slid it across the counter. "On the house," she said. "You look like you're between places." Wes accepted the cup, surprised by the accuracy of the statement. "That obvious?" Ingrid shrugged. "People who belong somewhere don't look at the door that much." He left with warm bread wrapped in paper and no questions asked. Back on the road, Wes felt the faint, unsettling sensation of being seen, not evaluated, not judged, simply noticed. It was rarer than he liked to admit. They drove on. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in low and thin, stretching the light into silver. The lake darkened, and the wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of ice shifting against shore. Wes passed a gas station with 2 rusted pumps and a flickering sign. He slowed, then stopped. As he opened the truck door, Sable stood abruptly. Not alarmed, not aggressive. Blocking. The dog positioned himself squarely between Wes and the open space beyond the door. Body angled, head low, ears forward. His tail was still. Wes froze, instinctively trusting the signal. He scanned the area. Two men near the pumps, mid-30s, heavy coats, eyes lingering too long on the truck bed. Nothing overt, nothing provable. But Sable didn't move. Wes closed the door and started the engine again. He pulled away without making eye contact. A mile down the road, he exhaled. "Good call," he murmured. Sable sat again, as if nothing had happened. They camped that night near a stand of birch trees, the pale trunks glowing faintly under moonlight. Wes ate the bread Ingrid had given him, shared the last bite with Sable, and listened to the sound of melting ice ticking against the shore like slow applause. He slept lightly, wrapped in his jacket, one hand resting unconsciously on Sable's harness. No dreams came, just the steady awareness of being alive and awake in a place that did not demand anything of him. Morning arrived quietly. Wes stretched, his shoulder twinging, a reminder, not a warning. He rolled it gently, then stood and breathed in the cold air. Sable moved ahead, nose low, reading the ground like a map. That was when he found it. A small metal object lay half buried in damp leaves near the edge of a narrow trail. Sable pawed once, carefully, then stepped back and looked at Wes. Wes crouched and picked it up. A search and rescue team tag. Old, scratched, the enamel chipped at the edges. On the back, someone had etched words by hand, uneven but deliberate. "Return with your team." Wes closed his fingers around the tag. For a moment, he felt something close to laughter rise in his chest. Not humor, but the absurdity of recognition. He'd carried men out of whiteouts. He'd followed radio calls into darkness. He'd been part of teams that didn't ask questions when it mattered. Now his team consisted of a dog and a truck with bad mileage. "Guess we're still in," he said quietly. Sable's ears flicked, as if in agreement. They were back on the road when it happened. No warning, no sound. Sable, who had been half dozing, snapped fully alert. He stood, bracing his front paws against the dashboard, nose lifted toward the windshield. His body went rigid, not tense, but focused with a precision that sent a chill through Wes. "What is it?" Wes asked. Sable didn't look at him. Instead, the dog pressed one paw against the glass, pointing, not at the road, but at a narrow, unmarked turnoff slipping past them on the right. A service road, barely more than a scar in the trees. Wes hesitated. There was no sign, no reason. The GPS showed nothing. Sable let out a low, almost inaudible sound. Not a growl, a request. Wes turned the wheel. As the truck jolted onto the rough path, something in Wes's chest loosened, as if a decision he hadn't known he'd been carrying had finally been made. The service road climbed steadily, pulling them away from the lake and into thicker forest. Pines closed in, their branches heavy with old snow. Light filtered down in broken columns, dusted with drifting ice crystals. The road ended abruptly in a clearing. Wes cut the engine and listened. No traffic, no wind, just the distant creak of trees settling. Sable jumped down and circled once, methodically, then stopped. He stood facing uphill, ears relaxed, tail neutral. "This where you wanted to be?" Wes asked. Sable sat. Wes leaned back against the hood, looking around. The clearing felt intentional, not maintained, but respected. The kind of place people passed without noticing unless they were looking for something they couldn't name. He didn't see a cabin, didn't see a sign, just space. For the first time since leaving town, Wes didn't feel like he was running. He felt like he had arrived somewhere adjacent to an answer, close enough to wait. They stayed until dusk, then drove on again. The image of the clearing lingering in Wes's mind, like an unfinished sentence. By nightfall, the road narrowed again, and Wes pulled over near another stand of birch. They made camp in silence. As Wes lay back and watched the stars appear between branches, he realized something unsettling. He hadn't thought about paperwork all day. He hadn't thought about eligibility or deadlines or units reassigned. He had thought about roads, about signs that weren't there, about a dog who seemed to know when to stop and when to move. Sable curled beside him, warm and solid, his breathing slow and even. Wes rested his hand on the dog's side and closed his eyes. Tomorrow could wait. For now, the road had chosen them both. Morning reached the forest before it reached Wes. It came first as a thinning of dark, the kind that softened edges without fully revealing them. The air felt different, less brittle, more awake. When Wes opened his eyes, his breath no longer fogged immediately. Somewhere above the canopy, sunlight had begun the long work of finding its way down. Sable was already up. The German shepherd stood at the edge of the clearing, body relaxed but intent, nose lifting and lowering as he sampled the air. His coat caught what little light there was, cream and gray along the chest and legs, darker along the spine. The colors blending so naturally into the forest that he seemed grown from it rather than placed there. Wes rose slowly, stretching his shoulders, his soul. The familiar ache in his right shoulder greeted him, steady and dull, like an old reminder rather than a warning. He rolled it once, then let it be. "All right," he murmured. "Let's see what you found." Sable glanced back, then turned uphill. The path was barely a path at all, just a thinning of underbrush where animals and weather had agreed to pass more often than elsewhere. Sunlight filtered through the pines in long, angled shafts, catching on drifting ice crystals and turning them briefly into sparks. The snow here had melted unevenly, leaving dark soil exposed in irregular patches that smelled rich and alive. Wes followed without rushing. The higher they climbed, the quieter the forest became. Not silent, never silent, but composed. The wind moved through branches with restraint. The ground absorbed sound rather than throwing it back. That was when Wes saw it. At first it registered as absence, a shape where trees should have been closer together, a shadow that held even as light shifted. His instincts, dulled by months of civilian uncertainty but not gone, pricked faintly. "Hold," he said softly. Sable stopped immediately. They approached together. The structure revealed itself slowly, as if waiting to be noticed rather than discovered. A small fire lookout cabin, set into the slope of the hill. Not tall, not prominent, just present. Its walls were weathered but intact, the wood darkened by years of sun and snow. Moss clung to the north side of the roof, and a thin line of rust traced the edges of the metal panels. The door was closed. No lock. No sign. Wes felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, not excitement. Recognition. Someone had built this to last, not to be seen. He circled the cabin once, boots sinking softly into damp earth. No fresh tracks, no trash, no broken glass. The place had not been vandalized or abandoned in haste. It had been left. Sable moved ahead of him, checking the perimeter with quiet efficiency. He sniffed the base of the walls, paused at the corners, then returned to the door and sat. Clear. Wes rested his hand against the wood of the door. It felt solid, the grain worn smooth by time rather than neglect. He pushed gently. The door opened inward with a low, familiar creak. Inside, the air was cooler but not stale. It smelled faintly of old wood, metal, and something cleaner. Pine resin, maybe. Light entered through a narrow window, illuminating a space that was small but deliberate. Everything had a place. Shelves lined one wall, holding neatly arranged gear, coiled rope, first aid supplies, flares sealed in metal tins. A compact workbench stood beneath the window, its surface scarred but clean. A folding cot leaned against the far wall, its canvas taut, unused but ready. This was not a shelter thrown together in desperation. This was a system. Wes stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The sound of the latch settling felt heavier than it should have. He set his pack down carefully, then stood still, listening. Nothing. No hum of machinery. No ticking of cooling metal. Just the quiet persistence of the forest outside. Just for the night, he said aloud, as if the room needed reassurance. We don't take what isn't ours. Sable moved through the cabin one more time, nose low, tail neutral. He paused near the back wall, then sat, posture easing. Safe. Wes allowed himself to breathe. He spent the next hour doing nothing that could not be undone. He wiped down the workbench with a scrap of cloth he carried. He unfolded the cot just enough to check its joints, then folded it back. When he drank water, he used his own bottle. When he needed warmth, he layered his jacket rather than reaching for the small stove tucked neatly into one corner. Habits mattered. Ownership was a dangerous thing. On the shelf above the bench lay a notebook, leather-bound, edges worn smooth by handling. Wes hesitated before touching it. In the field, reading another man's notes without permission had been a breach of trust. But this place had no one to ask. He opened the notebook carefully. The handwriting inside was precise and restrained. Block letters, technical shorthand. Not a diary, a log, wind patterns, fire break distances, battery output recorded by date, notes about snow load on the roof and how to let it accumulate for insulation rather than clearing it away. This person had understood winter. Wes turned a page and stopped. A sentence had been underlined twice, the pressure of the pen slightly deeper than the rest. Don't turn safety into a cage. He read it again. Something about the words unsettled him. Not because they were unfamiliar, but because they were accurate. He had spent years building safety into systems, protocols, armor. He had trusted cages made of training and command structures. And now, without any of that, he was standing in a place built by someone who had chosen restraint over control. He closed the notebook and set it back where it had been. The sound came just as dusk began to settle. Not loud, not sudden. A vibration. Sable lifted his head first, ears angling not toward the door, but upward toward the ceiling where wood met stone. His body went still, not tense, but alert in a way Wes hadn't seen since active operations. Wes followed the dog's gaze. At first he heard nothing. Then, faint, almost imperceptible, a rhythm. Not mechanical, not animal, footsteps, distant. Passing overhead, somewhere along the ridge above the cabin, Wes froze. No shadows crossed the window. No sound approached the door. The steps moved steadily, then faded. Sable did not growl, did not bristle. He simply watched until the sound was gone, then sat again, calm restored. Wes's pulse slowed. Not a threat, he whispered. Sable's ears flicked, as if to agree, but the knowledge lingered. This place was not forgotten. It was simply respected. Night came quietly. Wes unfolded the cot and lay back, boots lined neatly beneath it, jacket folded within reach. He stared up at the ceiling, tracing the grain of the wood as the darkness deepened. He thought about the road behind him, about the clearing they had passed earlier, about the way Sable had led him here without urgency, without force. He thought about the line in the notebook, safety into a cage. He closed his eyes. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep and untroubled. Morning inside the cabin arrived without drama. Light crept in through the narrow window, soft and pale. Wes woke before Sable, his body still trained to rise early, but he did not move immediately. He listened to the quiet, The cabin held the cold back just enough to be comfortable. Sable stirred, stretched, and rose. He checked the door, the window, the corners, then returned and sat, satisfied. Outside, the forest glowed with early sun. Meltwater dripped from branches, the sound steady and patient. Wes stepped out and inhaled deeply. The air smelled of thaw and resin and something else. Possibility, maybe. He did not feel like he had found a destination. He felt like he had been given permission to pause. As he stood there, hands resting on his hips, Wes realized something else. For the first time since leaving the unit, he did not feel watched by expectation. Only by trees. Only by time. Sable stepped up beside him, shoulder brushing his leg. Wes rested his hand on the dog's neck and looked out over the slope, the forest stretching endlessly beyond. "Just for a little while," he said. The words were not a promise. They were a boundary. The sound reached Wes before the sight. Not footsteps, not voices. An engine, old, uneven, familiar in the way rural sounds always were. It moved slowly along the service road below the ridge, coughing once, then settling into a steady idle. Wes looked up from the workbench, instinct sharpening without urgency. Sable was already at the door, not blocking, not tense, waiting. Wes stepped outside into the pale morning light. The forest was fully awake now. Sunlight pooled between the pines, and meltwater traced thin, silver lines down the slope. From the road emerged a small, battered postal truck, its white paint dulled by winters and gravel. It stopped a respectful distance from the cabin. The driver's door opened. The woman who stepped out moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had walked these roads for years and learned which ground would hold her weight. She was in her late 40s, perhaps early 50s, of average height. Her frame lean but strong in a way that suggested endurance rather than youth. Her hair, dark with streaks of iron gray, was pulled back into a low knot beneath a knit cap faded by sun and snow. Her skin was weathered, not harshly, but honestly, as if she had spent more mornings outside than in front of mirrors. She wore a navy jacket with a frayed patch on the sleeve and sturdy boots dusted with old snow. Her eyes took in the cabin first, then Wes, then Sable. She did not flinch. "Well," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying easily through the quiet. "It looks like someone found the high ground." Wes remained still, hands visible, posture open. "Morning." She nodded once and stepped closer, not crossing the invisible line Sable seemed to hold near the door. Her gaze lingered on the dog, his stance, his calm. "Juniper Crow," she said, touching 2 fingers briefly to the brim of her cap. "Most folks call me June. I run mail and keep an eye on things the Rangers don't have time for." Her tone carried no challenge, just information. Wes inclined his head. "Wes Hartman." June's eyes flicked to his shoulder, then to his hands. The way he stood, the way he listened. "Ex-military," she said, not asking. "Yes." She smiled faintly. "Figures." Sable stepped forward then, slow and deliberate. He stopped just short of June and lifted his nose, sniffing the air near her gloved hand. After a brief pause, he touched his nose to her knuckles and stepped back. June let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That's new," she murmured. "He doesn't do that often, does he?" "No," Wes said. "Good sign," she replied. "For both of us." They spoke outside, leaning against the cabin wall where the sun warmed the wood. June explained without embellishment. The cabin sat on land tangled in jurisdiction, federal oversight layered over state management, with private holdings nearby. It had once belonged to a fire lookout who'd chosen solitude over retirement. He'd left quietly years back. No forwarding address, no fuss. "Place like this," June said, gesturing toward the trees. "Doesn't like being claimed, but it doesn't mind being respected. She laid out boundaries with the same calm clarity she used for directions and weather warnings. "No inviting folks up here," she said. "No structural changes without clearance, and the trail stays clear. Search and rescue uses it in bad seasons." Wes listened, nodding once at each point. "I'm not here to stay," he said. June studied him for a moment. "Nobody ever is," she said gently. "At first." She reached into her truck and returned with a thermos, setting it on the low stump near the cabin. "Coffee, strong enough to wake the dead?" Wes almost smiled. The morning passed in quiet cooperation. Wes cleared fallen branches from the trail while June sorted mail into weatherproof boxes further down the road. Sable moved between them, observant but relaxed, occasionally sitting where he could watch both directions at once. June worked with efficiency born of repetition. She did not rush, but she did not linger. When she spoke, it was with purpose. When she was silent, it felt intentional rather than awkward. "You planning to move on soon?" she asked at one point. "I don't know," Wes replied truthfully. June nodded, as if that were the only acceptable answer. It happened when Wes bent to lift a length of fallen fencing wire. The sound was sharp and sudden, a snap, followed by a hiss of breath he hadn't meant to release. Pain flared across his right shoulder, bright and immediate, stealing his balance for half a second. Before he could steady himself, Sable was there. Not frantic, not loud. He pressed his body gently against Wes's side, grounding him, weight solid and warm. His eyes locked onto Wes's face, unblinking, steady. June had noticed. She didn't rush forward, didn't ask if he was all right. She simply watched the way Wes breathed through the pain, the way he adjusted his grip, the way Sable held position without crowding. "Old injury," she said quietly. "Yes." June nodded. "That'll change how long you think you can run." Wes met her gaze. There was no pity there, only recognition. The moment passed, the pain dulled, work resumed. But something had shifted. By early afternoon, the trail was clear and the sun sat higher, its warmth coaxing the scent of damp earth into the air. June packed up her last delivery and turned back toward her truck. She paused at the edge of the clearing. "You're welcome to stay a bit," she said. "Long as you remember this place isn't yours." Wes nodded. "I understand." June smiled, a small, genuine thing. Most people don't. She climbed into her truck, engine coughing back to life. Before pulling away, she leaned out the window. "One more thing," she said. "If you're going to play forest god, at least make decent coffee." Then she was gone, the sound of her engine fading into the trees. The quiet that followed was different. Not emptier. More settled. Wes stood for a long moment, hands on his hips, looking at the place around him. The cabin, the trail, the forest that did not care who he had been, only how he behaved now. Sable sat nearby, ears relaxed, tail loose. Wes felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not relief, not purpose. Permission. He hadn't been given approval. He hadn't earned ownership. But he had been allowed to exist here without explanation. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing, Wes returned to the cabin. He cleaned the tools he'd used, stacked them neatly where he'd found them. He checked the latch on the door, not to secure it, but to ensure it closed properly. Sable lay near the threshold, eyes half-lidded, watchful but at ease. Wes sat on the step and drank the last of June's coffee, bitter and strong. He thought about boundaries, about how the military had taught him to push past them, about how this place demanded he respect them instead. For the first time in a long while, he felt no urge to prove anything, only to keep things the way they were. For now. Gideon Pike did not arrive loudly. There was no engine announcing him from a distance, no careless crunch of gravel. Wes noticed him the way he noticed changes in weather, by absence. The birds quieted first. The forest shifted its attention. Sable rose from his place near the cabin door, not bristling, not blocking. He stood tall, ears forward, body loose but ready, his gaze fixed downhill, steady and assessing. Wes followed the line of sight and saw the man emerge between the trees. He was tall, just over 6 feet maybe, and lean in the way men became when they stopped trying to be anything other than useful. His coat was heavy canvas, brown and worn thin at the elbows. Work pants were tucked into boots crusted with old mud and ice. A wool cap sat low over a face cut with sharp planes. A long nose, high cheekbones, a jaw that had learned restraint early and never forgotten it. A beard framed his mouth, trimmed close, more gray than brown now. His eyes were the color of weathered steel, pale, direct, and unhurried. He stopped a few yards away. The man took in the cabin, the cleared trail, the stacked tools by the wall. Then his gaze shifted to Wes. Finally, it dropped to Sable. Sable stepped forward, not fast, not slow. He closed the distance, sniffed the man's gloves once, then lifted his head and met his eyes. No growl, no retreat, just presence. The man exhaled softly. "Well," he said, voice low and even. "That answers one question." Wes did not step back. He rested his hands loosely at his sides. "Depends what you were asking." The corner of the man's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Fair enough." He removed his cap, a gesture that carried no submission, only courtesy. "Name's Gideon Pike." "Wes Hartman." Gideon nodded once, as if the name fit. His gaze flicked briefly to Wes's shoulder, then back to his face. "Ex-military," Gideon said. "Yes." "No trouble?" Gideon asked, not accusing, not curious, simply confirming. "No." Sable returned to Wes's side and sat, posture alert but calm. Gideon watched that too. They stood in the open space between trees and cabin, the sun breaking through clouds in thin bands. Gideon spoke first. "This land," he said, gesturing vaguely with one gloved hand, "belongs to me. Has for 27 years. I don't come up here much anymore." He flexed one knee slightly, as if reminding it who was in charge. "Cold's hard on old joints." Wes waited. "I let a man build that cabin," Gideon continued. "Years back. Fire lookout. Engineer by training. Quiet. Kept to himself. Asked permission instead of forgiveness." "What happened to him?" Wes asked. Gideon's gaze shifted to the tree line. "He left. By choice." Wes absorbed that. Choice mattered. "I'm not here to throw you out," Gideon said. "I'm here to know who's on my land, and why." Wes nodded. "I don't want charity, and I don't want to take what isn't mine." Gideon studied him, eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but focus. "Good, because I don't offer either." They walked together along the trail Wes had cleared. Gideon's steps were measured, his eyes attentive to the ground, the trees, the angles of slope and water runoff. He noticed the repairs Wes had made, the restraint he'd shown in not overclearing. "You didn't touch the roof," Gideon said. "Snow insulates," Wes replied. "You clear it, you lose heat." That earned a longer look. "You didn't expand the fire ring." "Didn't need to." Gideon stopped, turned fully toward him. "You didn't stumble into this place." "No," Wes said. "I didn't." They stood there a moment, the forest listening. Gideon's gaze dropped suddenly. Not to Wes, but beyond him. Sable had risen. The dog's body had angled slightly toward the eastern edge of the clearing, ears forward, tail neutral. Not alarm. Attention. Gideon followed the line of sight and went still. There, half buried beneath new grass and meltwater, was a narrow fence line. Old, sagging, nearly invisible unless one knew to look. One post had rotted through, the wire slackened. I wondered when someone would notice that, Gideon said quietly. Wes hadn't. Not yet. Sable had. Gideon crouched with a soft grunt and examined the post. Herd pressure's been pushing this way, he murmured. Haven't had the hands to fix it. He stood again and met Wes's eyes. Animals always know first, he said. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that this was not about territory alone, but awareness. They returned to the cabin as clouds gathered again, thickening the light. Gideon leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. Here's how this works, he said. You stay, for now. Wes did not respond immediately. You keep the trail passable, Gideon continued. Fix fences when they break. Clear trees after storms. Don't expand. Don't invite people who don't respect the quiet. And ownership? Wes asked. Gideon's eyes sharpened. That's the trick. Ownership changes things. Makes people forget they can leave. Wes nodded slowly. He understood that better than most. If I want to go? Wes asked. Then you go, Gideon said. No strings. And if I want to stay longer? Gideon considered him. Then we talk. He reached into his coat and produced a key. Old, iron, heavy in the palm. He didn't offer it yet. Just let it exist between them. Opens a shed 1/2 mile east, Gideon said. Tools, materials, things you'll need if you're doing more than surviving. Wes looked at the key, then at Sable. The dog sat quietly, eyes moving between the two men. Gideon followed the look and nodded. Dogs know who belongs. And you? Wes asked. Gideon smiled then, not kindly, not cruelly, honestly. My instincts tell me you don't take more than you earn. He closed his hand around the key and slipped it back into his pocket. That's the agreement, Gideon said. No paper, no deadlines, just work and choice. They shook hands. Gideon's grip was firm, not testing, a confirmation, not a challenge. As Gideon turned to leave, he paused at the edge of the clearing. One more thing, he said over his shoulder. The man who built this place, he had a rule. Wes waited. To leave it better than you found it. Gideon walked back into the trees, his steps quiet, absorbed by the forest. Sable watched until the last sound faded, then lay down near the cabin door. The afternoon passed with purposeful silence. Wes repaired the broken fence line, working steadily, mindful of his shoulder but not ruled by it. Sable moved along the perimeter, occasionally stopping to sniff the ground, then resuming his slow patrol. The work felt right, not heroic, not urgent, necessary. When the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long, Wes sat on the step outside the cabin and looked out across the land. He hadn't been given a mission. He hadn't been assigned anything. He had been offered responsibility, with the freedom to refuse. For the first time since leaving the unit, that freedom did not feel like abandonment. It felt like trust. They arrived on a morning that looked almost deliberately kind. The sky over the pines was a clear, patient blue, the kind that softened edges and made even hard things appear forgivable. Sunlight filtered through the branches in long, pale bands, warming the damp earth where winter still clung in patches of shadow. Wes noticed the vehicle before he heard it. A white SUV, clean enough to feel foreign on the narrow forest track, rolled to a stop just short of the clearing, its tires pressed into the softened ground with careful restraint, as if the driver understood, at least on some level, that this place resisted noise. Sable rose immediately. He did not bark. He did not rush. He stepped forward and stood squarely at the edge of the cabin's threshold, shoulders broad, posture composed, his ears angled forward, tail low and still. Not threat. Boundary. 3 people stepped out of the vehicle. The woman led. She was in her mid-40s, tall and lean, wrapped in a camel-colored coat that looked better suited to city sidewalks than forest trails. Her dark hair was pulled back into a precise knot at the base of her neck. Her face was striking in a deliberate way. Sharp cheekbones, attentive eyes, a smile that arrived quickly and stayed just long enough to feel practiced. Behind her were two men, younger, both clean-cut. One carried a camera bag slung casually over his shoulder. The other held a tablet, its screen already awake, reflecting the sky. "Wes Hartman?" the woman asked, voice smooth, calibrated. "That's me." "I'm Meredith Lane," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Director of Media Partnerships at Northlight Frontier Media." Wes did not take her hand immediately, not out of rudeness, out of habit. He glanced down instead, briefly, to Sable. The dog had not moved. Meredith noticed. Her smile tightened a fraction, then recovered. "He's protective." "He's perceptive," Wes replied. They spoke inside the cabin, though Sable remained near the doorway, lying down but alert, eyes following every movement. Meredith took in the space with visible appreciation, the rough efficiency, the restraint, the absence of anything ornamental. She spoke in phrases Wes recognized: reintegration, visibility, community narrative. "We tell stories that matter," Meredith said. "Stories that help people reconnect. Veterans, working lands, resilience." She gestured lightly as she spoke, hands precise, movements controlled. "We're not here to change your life," she continued. "We want to amplify it." Sable shifted. Not much. Just enough. When one of the men adjusted his chair closer to Wes, Sable's head lifted, eyes locking on the movement. No sound, no tension in his jaw, just refusal. Wes noticed everything. So did Meredith. The offer came gently. Northlight could help him return to the city if he wanted. They had housing partners, transitional support, legal assistance. Stability, Meredith called it, as if the word itself carried weight. "You shouldn't have to live like this," she said softly. That landed harder than she intended. Not because it was cruel, but because it was accurate enough to sound reasonable. That night, after they left, Wes sat alone on the edge of the cot. The cabin quiet except for the low, steady rhythm of Sable's breathing. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant surf. He pulled the old notebook from the shelf. He hadn't planned to read it again. The page opened naturally, creased where it had been folded too many times. "Don't turn safety into a cage." He closed his eyes. Safety had been used as a justification before. Orders given for protection. Systems built to help. He had watched lines blur between care and control, between assistance and ownership. The difference, he knew now, was authorship. Near midnight, Sable rose without sound. He crossed the cabin slowly, deliberately, and stopped beside the notebook shelf. He sat and stared. Not at Wes, but at the wood grain above the shelf, where a single nail protruded slightly, catching the moonlight. Wes followed his gaze. Nothing moved, nothing threatened, yet the dog remained still, focused, as if marking something unseen. Wes reached out and rested his hand on Sable's shoulder. The dog did not look at him. He stayed fixed on the space between light and shadow, quietly insisting that not all dangers arrived loudly. Meredith returned 2 days later, alone, no camera, no crew. She looked tired. The precise edge of her appearance had softened. Her coat was zipped higher, her hair less immaculate. "I sensed hesitation," she said once they stood outside. "I wanted to address it." Wes listened. The revised offer was better. More resources, fewer conditions, at least on paper. Meredith lowered her voice at one point, just enough to make it feel personal. You won't always be able to do this, she said. Bodies wear out. Dogs age faster than men. That was the blade. Not the city. Not the money. The future cost of loving something that depended on him. Sable stood beside Wes, close enough that his flank brushed Wes's leg. The dog's ears were neutral, but his eyes never left Meredith. I won't do it, Wes said. Meredith blinked. You didn't hear the revised. I heard enough. Silence stretched. You're choosing uncertainty, Meredith said at last. I'm choosing authorship. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, tight-jawed. I hope your pride keeps you warm. It already does. She left without another word. That afternoon, Wes dismantled the temporary markers Northlight had placed along the trail. Sable helped in his own way, dragging loose boards aside, nudging debris clear. When the last sign was gone, the land felt quieter. Not empty. Honest. Wes sat on the step at dusk, the sky fading to pale gold between the trees. Sable lay beside him, chin resting on his paws, eyes half closed. Some help came with chains you couldn't see until you moved. Some stories were only worth living, never selling. The light faded. The forest remained. Spring arrived without ceremony. It did not announce itself with warmth or birdsong. It came instead as a soft loosening, ice retreating from the edges of the stream, snow shrinking back into the shadows beneath the pines. The air changed first. It lost its bite. It lingered on the skin rather than cutting through it. Wes noticed it the way he noticed everything now. Quietly. He stood outside the cabin early, breath no longer fogging the air as thickly as it had weeks before. The ground beneath his boots was dark and wet, smelling of thawed earth and old needles. Somewhere downslope, water moved again, black and glossy, like ink returning to a page. Behind him, Sable lay stretched out in the open. Not at the doorway. Not blocking the threshold. Out in the sun, the dog's long body was relaxed, chest rising and falling in a slow, unguarded rhythm. His ears rested at ease, angled outward. His eyes were half closed, following nothing more urgent than the warmth creeping through his fur. Wes stopped moving. That, more than the weather, told him something had shifted. For months, Sable had positioned himself with intent. Between Wes and the world, between the cabin and the trees, between silence and intrusion. It was not fear that drove him, but duty. The kind that stayed awake even when exhaustion pressed in. Now the duty had eased. Wes felt it settle into his chest, like a held breath finally released. He brewed coffee over the small stove and carried the mug outside, careful not to disturb the dog. Steam rose briefly, then vanished into the morning. The forest watched them without comment. This place had never demanded explanations. Juniper arrived just after noon. She came the way she always did, on foot, following the narrow service trail with steady confidence. Juniper Crow was in her late 40s, tall and wiry, her build shaped by years of walking routes that did not forgive carelessness. Her hair, the color of weathered bark, was pulled into a low braid beneath a faded knit cap. Her face carried lines earned by observation rather than worry. Her eyes pale and attentive. She carried coffee, real coffee. Well, she said lightly, nodding toward Sable. Looks like your guardian has decided to retire. Sable opened one eye, regarded her calmly, then closed it again. Juniper smiled. "So that's the highest compliment I've ever received." They sat on the rough bench outside the cabin, sunlight filtering through the branches overhead. The warmth felt earned. Juniper spoke of small things. The condition of the lower trail, a fallen marker she'd reset near the creek, a pair of hikers who'd passed through without trouble. Wes listened more than he spoke. When Juniper left, The quiet returned, full but not heavy. Later that afternoon, Gideon Pike came up the trail. Gideon was 60, broad-shouldered, his strength settled deep rather than carried on the surface. His beard was gray and trimmed short, his face cut with angles sharpened by decades of wind and labor. He moved without hurry, but with purpose, as if the land itself set his pace. He carried a folder under one arm. "It looks like spring's winning," Gideon said, scanning the clearing. "For now," Wes replied. They sat at the table outside, mugs between them. Gideon opened the folder and slid it across. The papers were plain. No heavy language, no hidden weight. A long-term seasonal use agreement. Conservation clauses, maintenance responsibilities, the right to leave, no trapdoors. "You don't have to sign today," Gideon said. Wes picked up the pen anyway. "I'm not staying because I ran out of road," he said quietly. "I'm staying because this is where I stopped running." Gideon watched him for a long moment, then nodded once. "That's the only reason that lasts." Wes signed. The sound of the pen against paper was unremarkable. No ceremony, no witnesses beyond a man who respected work and a dog who trusted the ground beneath him. That night, Wes woke before dawn, not from noise, from absence. He lay still, listening. The cabin breathed softly, the wind had eased. No pacing, no alert shift of weight near the door. Sable was outside. Wes rose and stepped into the cold blue light of early morning. The dog lay on the packed earth a few feet from the cabin, body stretched long, head resting on his paws, eyes open but calm. Not guarding, resting. Wes stood there longer than he needed to. Something ancient and wordless inside him recognized the sign. The weeks that followed settled into rhythm rather than routine. Wes repaired what needed repairing. He left alone what did not. He reinforced the eastern fence line, reset a section of trail where winter runoff had bitten too deep, stacked firewood with the quiet satisfaction of work done properly. Sable followed, but no longer led. He ranged wider now, nose deep in thawing earth, tail moving freely. He slept longer. Dreamed, perhaps. Sometimes he lay beside Wes as he worked, chin resting on a boot, eyes closed. Grace Holloway came by on Tuesdays. She was in her early 60s, solidly built, her posture upright despite the years. Her gray-streaked hair stayed tucked beneath her cap. Her postal jacket faded but well kept. She brought coffee, sometimes news, sometimes nothing more than presence. "You look different," she said one morning, studying Wes over the rim of her mug. "Feel different," he answered. She nodded, satisfied. Northlight did not return. The silence they left behind felt intentional, like a door closed gently rather than slammed. One afternoon, Wes carved a small wooden sign. Nothing ornate, just a rectangle of cedar smoothed by hand. He mounted it at the start of the narrow trail leading up the hill. The letters were simple. Leave quietly. Leave it better. When he stepped back, Sable approached and touched his nose to the wood. A brief, deliberate contact. An ending. Or a beginning. Wes wasn't sure which. He sat on the step at sunset, boots off, hands sore in the familiar way that meant something had been done right. The sky burned pale gold between the trees. The stream below caught the light and held it. The road would always be there. But for now, they had arrived. Sometimes we wait for miracles to arrive with thunder. A sudden rescue, a dramatic change, a door thrown open all at once. But often, God works more quietly than that. Sometimes the miracle is not the road opening ahead, but the moment you are allowed to stop running. Sometimes it is not the mountain being moved, but the strength to stand still and realize you are exactly where you are meant to be. In everyday life, we are taught to measure worth by speed, noise, and visibility. But faith often grows in silence, in honest work, in choosing integrity when no one is watching, in protecting what is good without needing to own it. If this story reached you, maybe it is because you are tired, or lost, or standing at a crossroads where the world tells you to hurry, but your heart asks you to listen. If so, remember this: God does not always change our circumstances immediately. Sometimes He changes our direction by giving us peace where we stand. If this message spoke to you, consider sharing it with someone who might need it today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or what part of the story stayed with you. And if you believe in stories that honor quiet strength, loyal hearts, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps, especially in the moments when the road grows silent.